Who is on their way to number 10? The Prime Minister's had a dreadful few days after his D-Day blunder, but the Tories are still trying to torture Labour with their disputed claims about tax. The power of the smaller parties has been centre stage this week. And there's been more antics on the campaign trail, and full-on Farage has been making the Conservatives very nervous. In the latest of our leader interviews, he will join us from Essex. And Stephen Flynn, the leader of the SNP in Westminster, will join us from Aberdeen. And with us in the studio for the programme this morning, Mel Stride, close ally of Rishi Sunak, the Work and Pensions Secretary, and the woman who would be Justice Secretary, Shabana Mahmood, if Labour wins the election. Welcome to you both. Mel, rough old week for you guys.
We've got time. We've got 4 weeks to the general election, Laura, and the only poll that's going to matter is what happens on July the 4th.
Thought you might say that. Shabana, are you feeling chipper?
Well, I agree. The only poll that matters is the one that takes place on July the 4th. We're in a strong position, but we're still out there fighting for every vote. OK, well, we'll look forward to speaking to both of you a bit later in the programme. And we'll hear from John Curtis, of course, who will give us his 60 seconds on Sunday, his need to know on the polls.
Now, as many as 1 in 4 2019 Tory voters are saying they will back reform.
And our team at the desk for the next hour this week: Amber Rudd, the former Conservative Home Secretary, Matt Rack, the boss of the Fire Brigades Union, and John Caldwell, billionaire, I think, and former Conservative donor. A warm welcome to all of you. And morning, of course, to you. Let's start with the headlines, as we always do. On the front of the Sunday Times, a front page that might please the Labour Party, they splash on their promise not to raise some key taxes in the manifesto coming this week. The Observer also has a Labour story going on the party's promise to set up specialist courts for rape cases. But the Daily Telegraph has an interview with the Energy Secretary, Claire Coutinho, who says that Labour's plans for net zero would risk blackouts. But Nigel Farage, we'll hear from him shortly, claims to the Express that Reform, his party, are the real opposition now. And, of course, many of the papers carry the worrying story about rescue teams' search for the missing TV presenter Dr. Michael Mosley, who disappeared while on a Greek island on Wednesday. And, of course, there'll be coverage of that across the BBC through the day. But let's, with you three, welcome, turn to the election. It's been a busy old week. And, John, I know you've been watching on for some time. You gave money to the Conservatives and backed Boris Johnson. But I know you've seen Keir Starmer too. He's been trying to get your support. Have you made your mind up?
No, not at all yet, no. I think the one thing that's fairly clear, I'm not going to be a Conservative voter. I think what the Conservative Party and Rishi did throughout COVID was really, really appalling. There was a huge waste of money and policies put into place that were not fair and were ridiculously over-generous in some cases and under-generous in others. So there's a lot wrong with what he did. So I was very critical of Rishi right the way through his Chancellor days, and I've seen nothing better since he's been Prime Minister. So I think the Tories have had the day. It's too late for them to recover. So definitely not a Conservative voter, unless they change dramatically in their policies, and that would be mainly to do with energy, because we cannot keep destroying the planet. And Rishi going back from 2030 to 2035, I saw as another really negative stance.
But you are still an undecided voter, and there are plenty
undecided,
of them.
and I am still there to be won, but I just don't see the Tories coming back from this in terms of what I wish to see. OK,
well, it's interesting. Pollsters often make the point there are still lots of undecided voters, which is why the parties are working so hard. So let's take a look at what happened this week with Who Won the Week. Well, he was off, then he was on. Nigel Farage will run as an MP, but he got splashed with a milkshake on the campaign trail for his troubles. Rishi Sunak missed the huge opportunity to appear alongside other leaders of the free world after he went home early from the D-Day commemorations, leaving Lord Cameron there to hobnob with world leaders in his place on Omaha Beach. It also gave Keir Starmer the chance to look like a Prime Minister in waiting alongside President Zelensky. And in the second of this week's debates...
26 separate tax hikes in the last Parliament.
About 12 new taxes that Labour are going to bring in.
Absolute rubbish.
Well, while the Tories and Labour were arguing, the smaller parties had the opportunity to display their wares. So, Amber, you're not in frontline politics anymore, but I know you'll have been watching closely.
Yes, I couldn't resist.
And what do you think of this week's events?
I thought Angela and Penny both did well. I quite thought that sort of scrapping was honest. They both had their lines to take and their points they wanted to make, and they did it. And it was rather charming. You could see at the end they were like, yeah, well, we got through that, didn't we? So I thought they both did well. I do think the seven-way debate has its challenges to cut through, and I'm not sure the others did, really.
And in terms of the overall picture, Matt, what do you make of what's happened in the last week of this campaign?
I think interesting. I just want to pick up on something John said, that I think there's some underlying features here. I think COVID is a big thing. I've spoken at a few events recently, and I think people's recollection of that time and how people feel failed by government and institutions is playing out in people's reflections as we approach this. So we will have all sorts of ups and downs, debates and so on, but I think there's a lot more deeper things going on.
It's interesting because, Amber, Rishi Sunak often talks about COVID as a positive for him. You know, in very, very many occasions, he mentions furlough very quickly as something that people liked about him.
Well, I think they did. I mean, I appreciate John takes a different view on that, but the fact is, for most people, the decisions he made to support people during the COVID pandemic was the right thing to do and allowed them to have enough money to carry on. It was absolutely critical.
John, in terms of what the Tories could do to get you back, you say you'd need to see something completely different, but what would that look like?
Well, it would definitely look like the environment first of all, but the environment coupled with making Britain strong financially. And what I want to see is a differentiating tax scheme that encourages inward investment in science and technology industries, but especially where the environment's concerned. Because in that way, as the environment becomes more and more of an issue, and of course it's a big issue today, but it's nothing compared to what's coming down the road in 10, 20 years' time. And whatever intellectual property we develop now, whatever intellectual products we develop now, will be eminently exportable over the next few years and will really grow Britain's GDP, but also grow the GDP per capita and therefore people's standard of living. And also the jobs will be higher paid. So it's all a virtuous circle, but trying to get any government to understand that seems nigh on impossible.
Well, it's interesting. We'll be hearing from our politicians in just a couple of minutes. Thank you all very much indeed for now. And Matt will be talking about the Labour manifesto as well. You were at the meeting where it was agreed behind closed doors. I'm
very much behind closed doors.
Sure, you've been sworn to secrecy, but maybe you can give us a few hints. So there is undoubtedly, as we've seen this week, a big challenge to Rishi Sunak and his allies like Mel Stride from the Reform Party. It is profound. How will they handle it? We'll hear from him in a minute. But Nigel Farage joins us from Essex this morning. Good morning to you. Thank you for joining us today.
Good morning.
Mr. Farage, if you get what you want in this campaign and you grab millions of former Tory voters, you're making it easier for Keir Starmer to get to number 10. Why do you want him to be Prime Minister?
I don't particularly, but I have to say the Conservatives have broken trust with the country, repeated promises in manifesto after manifesto to reduce net migration to tens of thousands a year, and now they've opened the doors to such a scale. Do you know that 1 in 30 people in this country today has come here in the last 2 years? The numbers are astonishing, the breach of trust is huge, and it's a total betrayal of all of those people that lent their vote to the Conservatives in 2019. And I do believe this should be the immigration election. The exploding population is impacting on housing, on rents, on the health service, on infrastructure, and the other two parties don't want to talk about it.
But some Conservatives, Mr. Farage, believe what you are doing also adds up to a betrayal, because the logic of you running in this campaign in the way that you are makes it much easier, potentially, for Keir Starmer to get to number 10. So I'll ask you again, why do you want him to be the Prime Minister?
Taking out polling companies like Savanta, who don't even prompt for reform, which is outrageous, opinion the same. If you look at the other polls, in the red wall, Reform are ahead of the Conservatives and are now the challengers to Labour. If you look in Wales, it is now neck and neck between us and the Conservatives. So in the Red Wall, a Conservative vote is a vote to put Labour in. The whole game is changing. This old tired mantra that a vote for this party or that party helps the other side. And look, back in 2015 when I led UKIP, we took more Labour votes than Conservative votes. So frankly, let's be honest, the election's over. Labour have won already. Whether the majority is 200 or 350 is almost immaterial. The real question here is who is going to provide a voice of opposition in Parliament and in the country to a Starmer government. The Conservatives are incapable of it. They argue more with each other than they do standing up and fighting for their constituents or the country. And I think reform needs to be in the House of Commons. And we've got a 5-year plan leading up to a general election of 2029. We're dead serious about this. The Conservatives had their chance. They've blown it.
Except that many viewers will remember that in this stage in 2017, Theresa May, a month out, was absolutely miles ahead in the polls. It looked like she was cruising to victory. Mel Stride's already told us, Shabana Mahmood's already told us and reminded everybody not a single vote has been cast. So you are taking voters' decisions for granted and claiming that you can be the real opposition. Is that credible?
I tell you what, if you went outside London and you met people in this constituency and others around the country who voted Conservative for the first time in 2019, they're loathing for the Conservative Party as such. There is no chance of them going back. So let's face the facts. I know from a media perspective, you'd love to think that it's undecided. The election is over. The question is who's going to be the opposition. And right now, we're just 2 to 3 points behind the Conservatives. If we overtake them, well, you could find a big surprise result in terms of who gives that voice of opposition.
Well, let's then turn to some of the policies that Reform is putting over. You took over the leadership rather dramatically this week, having said you wouldn't run. You are now running, but I think not everybody is familiar yet with your policies. Now, in Reform's contract with the people, you call for £50 billion worth of spending cuts. So which public services would you get rid of?
Well, here's the point. The Bank of England is paying vast amounts of interest on their QE borrowing. Yes, I know it's very technical for a Sunday morning. I'm doing a press conference tomorrow in which I'll lay out how we can save £35 billion before we even start. I'll unveil all of this tomorrow, but yes, you're right. We want to raise the level at which people start paying tax to £20,000 a year. Why? It'll take 7 million people out of the tax system, mass simplification, a huge incentive for those not in work to go to work, and that's what I'm going to lay out tomorrow morning.
But I think viewers would like to know this morning, your party's already saying you'll cut £50 billion of public spending, so which public services would you get rid of?
Well, it's not about getting rid of public services, it's about making them more efficient. It's about the National Health Service not swallowing up huge amounts of money in diversity training and things like this. We want to live in a country where everybody is treated equally. And by the way, raising the tax threshold to £20,000 will be a lot of civil servants that we can get rid of.
But even the highest figures for spending on diversity training, which you cite there, Conservative Way Forward, the group have looked at this, and they say the most that you could get back would be 427 million, which out of cuts of 50 billion, that's a drop in the ocean.
Well, OK. All right, I'll go on. The inheritance tax threshold should be raised to 2 million. We will go on with other areas like that, mass simplification of the tax system, which will bring us enormous savings.
In terms of other things that you might want to do, you said on Friday, and you've mentioned this morning, you'd like to reform the NHS and you'd like to have a French model. Now, in France, there are upfront costs that people have to pay. They get some of it back, but not all of it. Is that what you would like to see in this country, where people have to pay upfront for their healthcare?
Let's be clear. We want healthcare to be free at the point of delivery. That was the founding principle of the National Health Service. What we're not having a debate about is this. We've gone up from just a few years ago, spending 7.5% of our national cake to 11% of the national cake on health. And guess what? The delivery has got worse, waiting lists have gone up. This model is not working. The French system of mutualisation is producing far better returns, whether it's stroke, cancer or heart disease. What I'm saying is, let's have a proper, open debate about this, because frankly, everyone knows that the NHS is not working the way it was 20 years ago.
I want to ask you about the Prime Minister's early exit from the D-Day commemorations this week. After that, you said that he wasn't patriotic, and you said that Rishi Sunak didn't understand our history and our culture. What did you mean by that?
Yeah. Absolutely right. You know, he couldn't make a mistake over D-Day. He should have known in his heart that it was right to be there. I was there. I've been raising money for some weeks to send veterans back to Normandy. The vast majority of people in Britain felt this commemoration was important and the last opportunity to honour the remnants that are still alive. And by the way, I know what your question's leading at. 40% of our contribution in World War I and World War II came from the Commonwealth. He is utterly disconnected by class, by privilege, from how the ordinary folk in this country feel. He revealed that, I think, spectacularly when he left Normandy early. And out there now, there are millions and millions of people who were Conservative voters, traditional Conservative voters, not the Red Wallers, who are now thinking, do we go on supporting the Conservatives or do we support reform? And this is going to be, I think, the acid test of this election.
But, Mr Farage, when you say our culture, I think many of our viewers might imagine that you are trying, not very subtly, to emphasise the Prime Minister's immigrant heritage.
Yeah. I just made the point, 40% of our contribution in 2 wars came from the Commonwealth. Clearly, Mr Sunak doesn't understand that. And what an insult to the Americans. You know, that took place above Omaha Beach, where the Americans suffered so grievously. He has made the biggest mistake of his political career. If it wasn't an election campaign, there'd be a leadership challenge against him this week. The man is not fit to lead the country.
The Sunday Times today is carrying a story about one of your aides and colleagues, George Cottrell, who has a conviction for wire fraud in the America and has been named in another criminal investigation in Montenegro. Do you want him by your side on the campaign trail?
I, firstly, always stand by my friends. And secondly, there is a thing called Christian forgiveness. If people get convicted of something or do something wrong, well, they have another chance in life to go on and prove themselves.
Mr Farage, thank you very much indeed for joining us from Clacton Pier, I think, where you are standing for election. And there is, of course, a list of all the other candidates who are standing in Clacton. Information about every candidate who's standing in this whole general election is available for you on the BBC website. So wherever you live, you can check out what is going on. Now, we just have some important and sad breaking news to bring you this morning. There is very little detail so far, but we can tell you that a body has been found in the search for the TV and radio presenter Michael Mosley. That's according to a rescue worker in Greece who has spoken this morning to the BBC. The 67-year-old vanished on Wednesday while he was on holiday on the Greek island of Symi. You can read more about the story as it's developing on our website. Dr Mosley was, of course, known for his TV programmes and Radio 4's Just One Thing podcast, and we were lucky to have him on one occasion in the studio here, and of course we will be following that closely throughout the day. Now, let's then talk to Mel Stride, the Work and Pensions Secretary, who was listening to Mr Farage during that interview. Welcome to you.
Thank you.
I just want to ask you first of all about Mr Farage's remarks about Rishi Sunak not understanding our culture. Now, his defence of that was that Rishi Sunak doesn't understand the contribution from the Commonwealth and he doesn't understand the contribution from Brits in World War II. But what did you think of him saying that? And what did you think of his defence of those remarks?
So I think they were deeply regrettable comments. I'm not entirely sure he addressed the question that you put to him as to what he meant by that. He then went on to make various comments about those that had fought very gallantly and selflessly in the Second World War as part of the Allied effort. But I think deeply regrettable is how I would, because I think they are suggesting things. I'm not going to go any further than that because I don't want to stoke this whole thing up, but it just seems to me that that's an ill-advised thing to have said.
But you clearly have reservations about it, and I don't want to, lead you to somewhere you're not willing to go. But it is clearly something that you do feel concerned about.
I feel very uncomfortable with that. Look, we've had in our country, and it's a source of great personal pride, as somebody who supported the Prime Minister, wanted him to be the leader of our party and our Prime Minister, that I've sat around a cabinet table that's the most diverse in history. And I'm very proud of the fact that we have a British Asian who is right at the top of our government. And we can debate what he's done and what he hasn't done and what he's going to do and so on. We'll no doubt come on to that. But I think his involvement in government has been characterised by outstanding public service. And I'm very proud of that.
OK, let's talk then about some of those policies. Now, it's the Conservatives so far in this campaign who've been very busy announcing policy after policy after policy. But whether it's national service or ending what you would call the war on motorists, they're clearly designed to appeal to voters who have deserted you or may be about to desert you. And they are clearly the kind of voters that Reform UK is also going after. If you look at how the polls have been moving, isn't Nigel Farage beating you at your own game?
So I think you put the very sensible point to Nigel Farage, which is basically a vote for reform is a vote for Labour. It's going to help get Keir Starmer into number 10. What we've got to concentrate on, the leadership we've got to show, is to set out the clear choice that there is in this general election.
But I'm
so
asking
on the one
you that
hand,
you're announcing policies designed to appeal to those voters, and so far, Reform is actually gaining.
We have policies, and we're doing things that appeal to voters right across the piece. So we've already, for example, cut national insurance by 1/3. That's a tax cut for 29 million working people, worth £900 for an average earner. Those are important things that we're doing that have practical impacts on people's lives. Now, if we take the group that you're talking about, I think older voters who are equally very important to us, the triple lock plus is something that we will bring in, which will make sure that those pensioners who are already benefiting from the triple lock itself will not be dragged into paying income tax. Now, Labour, Laura, have said that they will not come forward with a triple lock plus, which will mean millions of pensioners being brought into income tax as a consequence of a Labour government.
Well, as you raise that, I just want to clarify for our viewers, you have, as a government, made many more pensioners pay income tax for the first time because you have frozen the levels at which people start to pay, and your plan now is to undo some of the damage you've already done to their wallets. So to be completely clear, that is what that plan is. You may want to put it forward at the election, but that is what that plan is.
Well, what actually the triple lock has done, of course, is increased pensions at a much greater rate than would otherwise have been the case.
£3,700 you're giving them a tax cut when actually you're giving them a bit of money back on something you'd already taken from them. But it is a tax cut because in the absence of doing it, they will be paying more tax under Labour. We've clarified that point, and our viewers are smart people. They know that taxes are at a record high in this country. Our viewers are smart people, and they listen carefully and they watch what politicians have been up to. And they've been watching also your policies. So let's have a look at some of the things that you've announced. Because you've announced quite a lot of spending, which is a bit topsy-turvy in this election. Labour are saying they won't spend much. You're saying you'll spend loads. The child benefit charge, 1.3 billion. The triple lock plus, you've just mentioned, 2.4 billion. 2.5 billion for your national service plans.
Yeah.
And you say it's all going to come from cracking down on tax avoidance. Yeah. Well, when Labour comes out with that as a way of spending things, the Tories say, oh, you're leaving a black hole. You never get that amount of money back.
Well, compare our record. There's something called the tax gap, which is the difference in what we should be bringing in through tax and what we actually do.
And
under
you did
Labour,
lots of work on it at the Treasury.
But the point is, judge us by our track record. So under Labour in 25-26, that figure was up around 7+%. Under ourselves, it was down at about 4-point-something%. So the evidence is we are much better at doing this. Now, you're right. Labour are saying they'll get
14 years.
Labour are saying they'll get 5 billion, so we're saying 6. So we're in a similar ballpark. But we have the track record to deliver. And all of those measures that you've just shown there, Laura, most of them are covered by that 6+ billion in 2029.
But if you're so great at cracking down on tax avoidance and getting money back for hard-working people, why haven't you done it already?
Well, we have been doing it, and there's more that we can do. So, for example, in my area of welfare, we've saved £7.7 billion over measures that we brought in over this Parliament. We cut fraud and error within the welfare system, within benefits, by about 10% last year, and we can go still further. So we're going to bring legislation in to give DWP the same kind of powers to clamp down on avoidance and evasion and benefit fraud that HMRC have, for example. So those things will have a significant impact.
You mentioned there, though, changes that you would like to make to welfare, and you are announcing this morning some extra money for talking therapies to help people get back to work, and you're also re-emphasising a lot of other changes that you want to make to the welfare system. But where's the evidence that these changes will save anything like the £12 billion that you claim it will? Because if you look at the lines and the graphs of welfare payments and the numbers of welfare claimants, under your time in charge as successive Conservative administrations, the lines go one way. They go up and up and up. So where's the evidence what you're announcing now will make a blind bit of difference?
Up and up is not sustainable, and that's something we're going to deal with, and that's the point. So if you held the case load for those of working age who are getting some kind of health and disability element to their benefits, that's a cost at the moment of £69 billion.
It's enormous.
That is forecast. Well, that's forecast to rise to 90 billion, and that's a clear number there. 90 billion. It's a 21 billion increase. If we just held the level of the caseload, it would actually be 14 billion less than the forecast. If we got the caseload back to where it was pre-pandemic, it would be about 34 billion lower than the forecast. We're saying 12 billion lower than the forecast in 5 years' time is eminently achievable with the reforms that we're bringing in. You mentioned the additional mental health support, because a lot of the issue here is younger people in particular with mental health problems. So over 500,000 additional talking therapies in the NHS, mental health and welfare hubs across the country, 150 of those, a mental health team for every single primary, secondary and further educational college in the country. Those are things that can move the dial. And one of the big reforms that I've brought in is to change the gateway into some of these benefits. The work capability assessment that the OBR says already will mean 440,000, almost 500,000 fewer people on those long-term benefits as a result of our reforms. The public expects and the taxpayer expects a sustainable system. It has to be fair to those that need support, but equally it must be fair to the taxpayer, and it must be sustainable if the public are going to have confidence in our welfare system.
And I'm sure that welfare will be an issue that we'll come back to later in the campaign.
Yeah.
We've been listening very carefully to you this morning. Some of your colleagues, though, are feeling very despondent, and some Conservative candidates I've been speaking to in the last few days feel very, very bleak about the prospect, not least because of the Prime Minister's decision to leave the D-Day commemorations. And I have to say to you, some of our viewers just could not believe this. Diane Lim told us the offence caused to veterans was real and unnecessary, but the total disregard for his responsibility to the country was exposed in his apology. I returned home before the International Leaders event. Is your campaign going as planned?
So on the specific point of D-Day, the Prime Minister has not run away from this. He has put his hands up. He has recognised a mistake, and he has apologised unequivocally, actually. He uses the words, "I am sorry." He feels it very deeply, and I know that because I know him quite well, and I know how patriotic he was. He, of course, attended the events in Portsmouth. He attended the British-led events in Normandy, but he did not attend the international event in Normandy, and he accepts that's a mistake.
How he could have made that judgment.
Can I just to go on, because I think this is really important, because it goes to the character of the Prime Minister. This is a man who did stand up for us as Chancellor during COVID because he cared about people's living standards, protecting jobs, their livelihoods and so on. We've got inflation down because he cares, and cost of living payments and so on, about people's welfare under those conditions. And as it comes to veterans, he has had in his cabinet Johnny Mercer as a representative of veterans right at the highest level. And we are now going to be bringing in legislation to enshrine the kind of support that we're giving veterans on health, on housing and welfare, for example. And all of that is happening because he cares deeply about those issues.
OK, Mel Stride, Work and Pensions Secretary. It's been great to have you with us in the studio for the first time this morning. Thanks so much indeed for your time. And remember, you can let us know what you think, as ever. You can email kuenssberg@bbc.co.uk, or if you're social media inclined, you can use the hashtag BBC Laura Kay, and you can watch what's happening on the website as the day unfolds. The headlines will be there, and of course the latest news on that sad discovery in Greece of the body of the TV presenter, Dr. Michael Mosley. Now then, Amber, you know what it's like to be a politician in a sticky moment.
I do.
How do you think Mel Stride and his colleagues will be able to pull things round? Because things do look very bleak for the Conservatives, don't they?
They do look very difficult, and I think that Mel handled that incredibly well. It's been a very difficult few weeks, and there's only one thing I do agree with Nigel about, which is that you just have to look at the polls. It's clearly going to be a Labour victory, and I think that a lot of Conservatives and Conservative voters are saying we need a strong opposition. Don't let them have a landslide. Make sure there's a strong opposition, and we can be the ones to do that. So vote for the Conservative candidate you know.
But that's interesting you say that, because you were in the cabinet during that huge turnaround time in 2017 when things completely changed in the course of a few weeks. But you think that is just not possible?
It doesn't feel like that. I mean, it feels like that. The 2017, when you're absolutely right, we went from sort of something like 17 points ahead down to neck and neck. That was about the campaign. And the campaign that Labour are leading at the moment appears to be very strong. There's one other thing I would say, having listened to the interview with Nigel Farage, is that in politics it is very easy to make announcements. It is all about the delivery. And Nigel Farage goes around making these extraordinary announcements, and he has no idea how to deliver. And the example of that I would give is that the whole Brexit campaign was about immigration. Vote for Brexit so we can curtail immigration. On and on it went. And actually, immigration has continued to increase 8 years after we voted. It's not about making policy statements, it's about delivery. And that's why people need to vote for MPs who can actually do that, or hold the people giving delivery to account.
Just before I bring Matt in, I just want to check, are you going to vote Conservative?
Absolutely. I always vote Conservative, but particularly because I have a very good local MP who I want to make sure, who's Conservative, is re-elected to hold the Labour government to account.
I just thought I had to check. Matt, you've got a real twinkle in your eyes.
I won't be voting Conservative.
So there we go. That's a big scoop. Headline, union boss won't be voting Tory. Matt, what do you make of the campaign so far?
It seems... a certain inevitability to it that Labour will win, and a question of how big that majority will be. But I don't think we should judge until, as people said earlier, until people have voted. So a lot can happen in the next few weeks.
So then on what Labour is putting forward. So I know you're sworn to secrecy about the actual manifesto, but we do know that one of your union colleagues, Sharon Graham, the leader of Unite, didn't endorse the manifesto. And it's fair to say not everybody on the left flank of the Labour Party is, cock-a-hoop about everything that Keir Starmer is planning to do. So what's your assessment?
Well, I'm from the left wing of the Labour Party, and look, I'm going to respect the manifesto process. We're sworn to secrecy. That will be published in due course. I suppose I'm less... To me, it's the point Amber made about delivery. I think what's published in the manifesto is clearly very important, and there has been a debate around that, and there will be an ongoing debate. I think one of the things that we've said as trade unions is we will be, after an election, making sure that Labour delivers on the elements that we're particularly interested in, which is around workers' rights, trade union rights, and so on. And we know there will be a debate around that, and there'll be pressure from other forces, media, business interests, and so on. That's inevitable. Our job as trade unionists is to make sure that we put our case on behalf of 6 million trade unionists as a whole, and on behalf of the Labour-affiliated unions in particular.
Pass then for Keir Starmer if he manages to win?
No, and I don't think he expects that, with all due respect.
John, listening to Nigel Farage and Mel Stride this morning, what went through your mind?
Oh, gosh, have we got all day? I think, first of all, I think a lot of what Nigel Farage says really hits the spot. I think he's a great orator. Whether he's an operator or not and can deliver, that's another matter. But with the Reform Party, I've got two major problems. One is that they are, I think climate deniers is maybe too strong, but they're very much about oil and gas, and that's going to be catastrophic for the future. And the second point is that Nigel himself is a big Trump supporter, and I can't sort of see any way of supporting somebody that supports somebody who I view to be immoral, unethical, and of course now proven criminal. So that bothers me. In terms of politicians in general, the problem is they sort of electioneer with the public by almost rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. And somebody needs to grab a plate and fix the leak. And the leak is very, very simple. The leak is that we have to grow GDP per capita. We have to grow people's income and at the same time support the environment. And that's why I launched Cordwell Strong Britain, which is a whole range of points of how to do that.
And you think that is the opportunity that they're all missing? Interesting. So you're a tough judge there, John, in the corner on all the parties. We've got another political party left to go, the SNP. So maybe we'll see if you give them any decent marks. But we're first of all going to take a look at the overall picture, because everything that's going on at the moment is about trying to influence what you will do in the privacy of the polling booth in 25 days' time. And Professor John Curtis, the nation's favourite number cruncher, is keeping an eye on the polls. It's 60 Seconds on Sunday.
Movement at last, but not in the direction the Conservatives were hoping. Every poll conducted since Monday's dramatic announcement that Nigel Farage was to return as Reform's leader has recorded a rise in Reform support, on average by 3 points. And every single poll has recorded a fall in Conservative support, on average by 2 points. Now, as many as 1 in 4 2019 Tory voters are saying they will back Reform, up from 1 in 5 last week. Meanwhile, at least 3 in 5 Tory voters disapprove of Mr Sunak's decision to leave the D-Day commemorations early. But it is too early to be sure whether that row has done further damage to the Conservatives' poll rating. But one bright spot for Mr Sunak is that Labour support has fallen back a bit too, reversing progress they made earlier in the campaign.
John Curtis, well, a 21-point lead in the polls is not to be sniffed at for the Labour Party. And their manifesto will be coming on Thursday. But today they're pushing forward some of their plans to increase prison places and cut back on reoffending. Well, Shabana Mahmood would be the Justice Secretary enacting those plans if you win the election. I want to start, though, Shabana, with the comments that Nigel Farage made about Rishi Sunak not understanding our culture and his explanation of those remarks this morning. Mel Stride said he was very uncomfortable with what he had done there. What did you think listening to that?
Well, look, I think this is a classic Nigel Farage trick. Lean just enough to signal a bit of a dog whistle and then lean straight back and sound perfectly reasonable and say something good about the contribution that Commonwealth soldiers, ethnic minorities made towards the war effort. We can all see exactly what Nigel Farage is doing. He's got form. It's completely unacceptable. This is a man that has a track record of seeking to divide communities. He just wants to do it with a veneer of respectability whilst he's at it.
OK, well, that's interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens with those remarks through the course of the day. Let's talk then about your brief of justice, courts, prisons and offending. Now, through the campaign, as viewers always do, also get in touch with us. People are also getting in touch with the BBC through Your Voice, Your Vote, where people can put forward their questions through the election. And we've had an interesting question from Chris Tebby in Nottingham, who's asked, without tax rises, how do the parties intend to address overcrowding in prisons? We know that it is a big, serious problem. So how would you address overcrowding in prisons if, as Labour repeatedly tells us, you're not planning big tax rises?
Well, actually, part of the reason we've got overcrowding in our prisons is because the government has run out of space, because they haven't delivered the full 20,000 prison places that they said they would do by next year. It's actually not a money problem in that respect. The money has already been allocated in the Ministry of Justice budget. It's actually a failure of the government because they've allowed the planning system to get in the way and they've allowed complaints from their members of parliament, backbenchers in particular, to stop any building in our country. So this is actually about the government having the will to get prisons built. On day one, we would designate prisons as being of national importance so that those decisions are ultimately made by ministers rather than the usual planning process.
If you become Justice Secretary, then you could force communities around the country to accept a jail, prison being built or expanded in their community, whether they like it or not.
Well, we would always want to work with local authorities and local communities. Of course, we would.
But you just said you would take the power to make the decision yourself.
We would always want to work with local communities, and we would, of course, deal with infrastructure issues that might be raised, transport links. It's in everyone's interest that the sites that are chosen for a prison building programme are suitable sites and ultimately successful sites as well. But I have a prison in Birmingham Ladywood constituency, so I know what it is to have a prison in your patch. And I consider these to be public assets that are necessary for public protection and in our national interest. And so when a site is suitable and we have made sure that the infrastructure and the transport is right, prisons are going to be built.
If you take over at the Ministry of Justice in a few weeks' time, though, you'll have an immediate problem of prisons being absolutely full to the brim. Now, the government has been trying to manage this by letting people out early. Would you continue that?
Well, look, I think actually the government needs to level with the public. We all know that prisons are running at either 98% capacity or 99% capacity.
So if you become Justice Secretary, as you hope...
It's a dereliction of duty that the government hasn't actually released all of the figures about their early release scheme. They've actually been doing that in secret. It would be irresponsible for me from opposition, without seeing the data about the number of offenders that have been released or having all of that information to help, to make those decisions.
But hang on, this is a question of principle. The government has been dealing with intense overcrowding in prisons by letting some offenders out early. Would you stop that, or would you continue with it?
Well, the government has been doing that in secret without releasing any of the data about the number.
My question is what you would do. You want to be the Justice Secretary in 4 weeks.
No, and I will address the whole point, but I think it's important to recognise we've got a dereliction of duty from this Prime Minister.
And you've made that point, so I'd like you to answer the question for our viewers.
I can't rule anything in or out because it would be completely irresponsible from opposition, without all of the information to hand, to make a decision about what we may or may not continue. What I can say is we will be transparent, we will release those figures, because we've been calling on the government to release those figures.
So
and
you
we
are
will
not
make
ruling
whatever
out...
decision is necessary in the national interest to get control of our prisons and to keep the public safe.
But you are not ruling out continuing early release?
It would be irresponsible to make those decisions from opposition without all of the information to hand. An incoming Labour government, if we're privileged enough to win, would have to lift that bonnet and see what horrors await.
But you have not ruled out continuing with early release, and you have committed also to publishing the numbers of doing that if you end up in that position.
Well, we've been pressing the government to release those figures.
But, and
since
you're
they brought
committing
this
to doing that
in, they've done it in secret. We will, of course, want to be open and transparent with the public about the scale of the crisis.
There's another interesting point of principle, because it used to be that politicians on both sides used to talk about wanting to get the prison population down. You know, our viewers will remember Ken Clarke, when he was in charge a long time ago, he used to talk about getting prison numbers down. On a point of principle, as somebody who wants to be in charge of the justice system, would you like the prison population to go up or down?
I think the prison population needs to reflect the number of offences that judges deem to be necessary for a custodial sentence. So it just has to track whatever is the need. We have to have enough prison places in the system. Of course, I want it to come down, because what I really want is for us to be a much more successful country at cutting reoffending. 80% of offenders in our country are actually reoffenders. We have a reoffending crisis that is actually exacerbating the capacity crisis that we have in our prison system. I would like us to be in a position where, as a society, we are creating better citizens out of people that go into our prison estate, rather than the better criminals that they're currently coming out as.
But you are saying you would continue with providing 20,000 extra places, as the government does. And it's interesting, because Keir Starmer used to say, and this is a direct quote from him, increasing prison places does not reduce crime.
Well, we need to increase the number of prison places because we have a capacity crisis. But alongside that, you do have to deal with reoffending. The rates of reoffending are sky high. They represent a failure of the prison system to rehabilitate offenders. That's bad for those people coming out of prison, but it's actually bad for wider society as well, because actually those people come out, they commit more crime, and they're straight back in again. So we do need to get to grips with reoffending. We would focus on having employment councils, working with prison and governors to have an employment council in every prison, working with local employers, making sure that the training that's on offer in our prisons reflects the jobs that are available in the local job market. That is a strategy not just for getting those offenders into work, but for cutting crime in the long term.
Now,
as well.
one of your sort of eye-catching policies that the party's put out this morning is about dealing with mopeds, those fast bikes that whiz around some communities, you know, raising merry hell. We can have a look at some of them now. We can see there are some lads going very quickly around on quad bikes. It's the kind of thing that sometimes people feel terrified of. Now, you're suggesting that you would crush those bikes seized by the police. So we've had a look at this, and actually some police forces already do it. So what's the difference in this?
Well, actually, we've been working with police forces who've been asking for this broader power. So at the moment, police forces can seize those bikes, but they have to hold on to them for 14 days. They usually impound them, and in fact, they get auctioned off at the end of that 14-day period, usually to the people that were causing the antisocial behaviour in the first place. So many police forces across the country have been complaining about this for a long time. This power that we would introduce would bring down that 14 days to 48 hours, at which point the police can destroy that vehicle.
OK, so more or less straight away, if somebody gets nabbed on an illegal bike, they just have it crushed then and there?
Within 48 hours, you can expect that bike to be crushed.
OK. We were just talking to Matt Rack from the Fire Brigades Union about the party, the manifesto process, and he was very clear that the unions are not going to give you a free pass. And some of the unions, Unite Union, didn't sign off the manifesto this time. Last week, there was a huge issue on the Labour left about how Diane Abbott had been treated. Just on a broad principle, if you are lucky enough to win and you win well, will it have been worth alienating some of your traditional supporters?
Well, firstly, I would never do our trade union movement the disrespect of assuming that they would give any government, including a Labour government, any kind of easy ride or a blank cheque. Look, we will be putting forward, and you will see on Thursday when our manifesto is launched, a positive programme for change in our country. We've had chaos under the Tories for 14 years. If they're elected again, we'll have 5 more years of chaos. We can turn the page and start to rebuild our country with a clear plan, which is what the Labour Party is putting forward. And I know that everybody across the Labour movement wants to see a Labour government and can get behind that plan.
That sounded like it might almost have been page 1 of a manifesto. It sounded pretty scripted, but campaigning. We are in a campaign.
We're in a
Shabana
campaign,
Mahmood,
Laura.
it's always good to have you here with us in the studio.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your time. Well, you know, the election is not just about the tussle between Shabana Mahmood's party and the Conservatives. There is a whole array of different races. In Scotland, the SNP is fighting to hold on to many of its massive 43 seats that it won in Scotland last time. It's had a very tough time and a drop in their support since Nicola Sturgeon quit. Stephen Flynn is the party's leader in the Commons, and he's with us from Aberdeen. Beautiful day there, Stephen Flynn. It's good to have you with us. It's interesting, during the campaign, you sounded like a bit of a different SNP. On Friday's big BBC debate, you didn't talk about independence at all. Have you given up?
Not at all, Laura. And, you know, I trust the nous of the Scottish people to know that the Scottish National Party fully believe in an independent Scotland, and I'm sure all of your viewers already know that. Of course, we are in a general election campaign, and that means we need to focus upon the biggest issues at Westminster, and that's austerity, £18 billion of public sector cuts coming down the line, what the IFS regard as a conspiracy of silence, the consequence of Brexit, and of course the ongoing cost of living crisis which people are facing. We're willing to deal with these issues head on. We're willing to challenge an incoming Labour government on their conspiracy of silence with the Tories on these big issues, and hopefully following the general election we'll be able to put some guts into the House of Commons to deal with these issues in order to improve the outcomes for people in Scotland.
But I don't remember ever seeing an SNP campaign like it, where basically anybody hardly ever mentioned the I word, and your party's policy was to treat this general election as a de facto referendum on independence. So isn't it a bit strange that you're not talking about it proactively, or does it actually tell us that you know it's on the back burner for many millions of voters and that's why you don't want to highlight it?
Well, of course, that was never an adopted party political position. Our position is very clear. The page 1, line 1 of our manifesto will say a vote for the SNP is a vote for an independent nation. That's what the SNP stand for. That is what we believe in. And of course, if we win the election, it will be for the UK Parliament, it'll be for Keir Starmer, in all likelihood the next Prime Minister, to then determine whether he will adhere to the democratic wishes of the people of Scotland, or whether he'll simply follow the well-trodden path of Theresa May, of Boris Johnson, of Liz Truss and of Rishi Sunak by denying the democratic will of the people of Scotland. That's very much a question for the Labour Party. I'm fully focused on making sure that we win this election in Scotland, that we put independence in the forefront of people's minds, but we also focus heavily on the cost of living crisis, on the damage being caused by austerity, on the damage being caused by Brexit, and our positive vision to deal with with that, to rejoin the European single market, to grow the economy by delivering net zero, to make sure that we have investment in our NHS and we tackle the cost of living crisis by providing people with financial support. That's in stark contrast to what's on offer from the main Westminster establishment parties. The SNP will never cosy up to the establishment in Westminster because we believe in Scotland's future.
But you have been, though, shifting your tone in various different areas. As your polling numbers have been very challenging for you, you have shifted position on various things. You're talking at us from your sunny, beautiful Aberdeen constituency where North Sea oil and gas supports thousands and thousands of jobs. Now, Nicola Sturgeon used to say she was very sceptical about new licences being granted for more development. But the new First Minister, John Swinney, doesn't take quite that stance. And Kate Forbes, his deputy, has said that new developments could quite possibly go ahead. So you have changed your tune.
Well, what we believe in, Laura, is a just and sustainable transition that protects the future employment of the tens of thousands of people who live behind me. Now, the reality is at this election, there are three options on the table. That just and sustainable transition that protects workers and creates the new net zero jobs of tomorrow. There's the Labour Party position, which of course would scrap 100,000 jobs and wouldn't invest in that net zero future because they've rolled back on their £28 billion net zero commitment. And then, of course, there's the Conservative Party position, which is to act like oil and gas will last forever when it won't. They're almost becoming climate deniers like Nigel Farage. So the option for people in Scotland is very clear.
You criticise Labour's plans for a windfall tax and their overall tax rate on oil and gas profits to 78%. And you say, and you've just repeated it there, that could cost 100,000 jobs. But the SNP has backed a windfall tax of 75%. So why is a 78% windfall tax a complete disaster and a 75% tax rate something that you support?
So there's two answers to that. Firstly, the additional revenue which the Labour Party are seeking to take in will not go into household bills. What it's going to do is flow from Scotland straight into nuclear power projects in England, which is of no benefit to people in Scotland. But secondly, and these aren't my figures, 100,000 jobs, these are independent investment experts. It's what Unite the Union refer to as putting people on the scrap heap. That is what Labour's future offers, is 100,000 job cuts. And I will stand against that because that's not in the interests of Scotland's economy. We need to make sure that we have a just transition which allows us to meet our climate targets. Now, just over my shoulder is a wind farm which Donald Trump, the famous climate activist, opposed. That provides enough energy to power all the homes in Scotland. Just out the back of this building I'm in is the largest floating offshore wind farm in the world. Scotland's future when it comes to renewables is huge, but we need to grasp it. The only way to grasp it is to invest. The Labour Party don't want to invest in that future. They walked away from £28 billion. The SNP want to invest in that future, and that is the difference of this election.
Stephen Flynn, thank you so much indeed for joining us from Aberdeen, looking glorious this morning. And there is a list of all the other candidates standing in Aberdeen South, his constituency. And just a reminder that do have a look on the website to see who the candidates putting themselves forward in your part of the world are. Right, let's see what our panel made of those two interviews. Amber, you were Home Secretary for a long time. Shabana Mahmood wants to be Justice Secretary. These are, justice and crime are very difficult briefs, a really, really tough gig for whoever is in charge. What did you make of her comments this morning?
I thought she did well. I think she made a very good point that she doesn't actually know what's going on in terms of the early releases. So until she gets in, she can't really comment on that. I would be more unequivocal about saying, of course, we want a lower prison population. The problem with the prison population is it continues to rise because we continue to give such long sentences, which is a new thing over the past sort of 30 years or so. Shorter sentences mean you can give more effective punishment and hopefully rehabilitate. I also think the thing about reoffending, so much more needs to be done about making sure that people have the support so that they don't reoffend and they're supported in their communities.
But all of that, though, costs money, doesn't it, Matt? And Labour is very, very firm. You know, it's sort of like a commandment through everything. They're like, nobody gets, you know, free, no shadow ministers get big cheques from Rachel Reeves to spend on what they fancy. I mean, how difficult do you think that makes things for the party?
I think that is going to be difficult. I think, again, that's one of those debates that's going to take place in the Labour movement and with the trade unions. I think some of us would have probably seen want to see a more clear commitment to greater expenditure, including addressing issues of tax. We'll see what the manifesto says on that, but I suspect you're right, there will be a very firm line on that. Nevertheless, some of those issues, some of the ones that Stephen raised there, are not going to go away. The question of how do you fund a just transition to a new economy are going to be a huge issues facing us.
So would you have rather that Labour had kept hold of their promise to put £28 billion a year into green and
I think we made no secrets at the time that that was our view, and I think it was probably the view of a number of the affiliated unions. That decision's been taken, but equally, as I said earlier, I think the questions about implementation, those issues will not go away. The question that was raised there, and you mentioned earlier about concern about jobs in oil and gas, has been raised by the two big industrial unions who are affiliated, the Unite and the GMB, have raised those points, and those debates will go on because people need jobs to pay their bills and sustain their lives.
But John, you've also raised though already that actually you think the big parties are just missing a big opportunity here, and it's interesting, climate change is an issue and an opportunity hasn't really come up much in the election campaign.
No, they missed the point completely. You know, there's a way of transitioning to net zero for Britain that in a very, very lucrative and profitable way. If we had the differential corporation tax to attract inward investment in science and technology, and especially in the environment, if we put a government fund, a big government fund, not 28 billion, which the Labour Party have cut, a much bigger fund, that could be seen as an investment rather than an expenditure. And that money could be invested, co-invested alongside wealthy people, wealthy investors, and alongside the originating company who's got the technology. In that way, the cost to get to net zero would actually be a positive benefit, not a negative, because the government would be taking shares in a business that was a future business that was paying high wages and that was going to deliver great export opportunities for Britain.
Well, we'll see if the politicians are listening to you this morning. Amber, just before you go, I know you were part of the Conservative Party in the front line for a very long time. They're having a very difficult time at the moment. You seem to be certain that Labour is going to be in power. But what do you think happens next to the Conservative Party then?
I really don't know the answer to that one. I think it depends who gets back in. For the Conservatives, I hope that the strong centre-right voices get back in so that when they have a reflection of what happened in this election, the centre-right can make the case for the fact that it wasn't because we were too right-wing, it's because we didn't occupy the centre space. And the centre ground, everybody says so, and it's always proved correct, is where you win.
And could there be a place for Nigel Farage in the party?
I certainly hope not.
Why?
Because I think he is, as Shabana said, a bad influence. I think he's divisive. Politics is hard enough to go into. There's enough abuse in politics. And if you have a voice that tries to divide people, and as she said, communities at the same time, it's going to make it even worse for people. I don't think he can deliver either. I think you need people who can really try and deliver and compromise.
OK, well, we will see what happens in the next few weeks. All three of you, it's been great having you with us this morning. As we go along, we check the politicians' facts as they happen. Today, Nigel Farage said that his party, Reform UK, was only 2 to 3 points behind the Conservatives in the opinion polls. That is a very selective take. There have been 3 polls where the gap between the two parties was that small, but many more where it has been wider than that. And several pollsters have put the Conservatives over 10% ahead of Reform. Mel Stride was talking about the Conservatives' record on closing the tax gap. That's the difference between the total amount of tax that's due and the amount the government actually collects. He said that the gap was lower under the Conservatives than under Labour, but that doesn't really tell the full story. It was already falling under the last Labour government, and it's just fallen further since 2010. And a reminder for you again of that very sad breaking news. A body has been found this morning in the search for the TV and radio presenter Dr. Michael Mosley on the Greek island of Symi. That's according to a rescue worker there who has told the BBC. The body is yet to be formally identified, but I'm sure everybody's thoughts will be with his friends and family today. So that is all that we've got time for this morning. A huge thank you to my guests, Amber, John and Matt. And an even bigger thank you to you, of course, for watching at home. And buckle up. As we've said, the manifestos are coming. It's another chance for the Tories to try to grab attention. Theirs is expected on Tuesday. For Labour, it's another moment when they will be trying above all else to avoid making any mistakes. Tomorrow night, the Prime Minister will be here with Nick Robinson at 8 o'clock on BBC One and on iPlayer in the first of that series of interviews with party leaders, plenty of them. And I'll be on Newscast later on BBC Sounds today. And as ever, you can catch up with anything that's been going on as iPlayer. And I will look forward to seeing you right here next Sunday, same time, same place.